And on the first day, I have to explain to them classical economic theory, but I also have to talk about race relations, and we have to talk about the effect of Ukraine on gas prices and foreign policy. And then we have to get into a discussion about morality and the fact that human morality picks policy preferences, and so the relationship between abortion and economic growth.
I'm Dr. Thomas Jeffrey, and I have with me today Dr. Shawn Williams. He's the lead professor of political science at Campbellsville University. He has a PhD in political science from the University of Texas at Dallas. He has been awarded the Non-Tenured Faculty Award here at Campbellsville University. He engages with students in game-based learning and experiential learning, and has even taken students to caucuses in Iowa and to the presidential inauguration, and he's taken students overseas. Are you still involved with the KIP?
Yes, still lead in the director of the KIP program.
Director of the KIP program. And is there anything going on with that?
There is actually. So depending on the airtime, coming up on March 22nd, Rachel Den Hollander is going to be coming onto campus. Rachel Den Hollander was the first young woman at the time to raise the flags about the abuse scandal with the United States women's gymnastics program. The first one to come forward and accuse Dr. Nasser of what he was doing. And so she has since become a speaker on the pro feminist movement. She's also a conservative, which makes her perfect for our campus. And so we'll be bringing her in about 3 weeks.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
And last time we talked, you had been doing some things on, and I'll probably get this wrong because they're both very hot topics, but religion and politics.
It's true. We had originally planned on trying to have a conference this semester on the intersection between basically Christian political mobilization, how Christian movements mobilize both pro-democracy and anti-democracy, because that's been a very hot topic recently. As we were organizing it, though, we were still in the waning days of COVID, and we were just not completely sure as to whether or not we could bring that kind of a conference onto our campus in April.
Sure.
So I think the plan is now to push that back into September. And have that whenever we come back for the next academic
Interesting.
year.
Well, we'll have to have you on again and talk more about that.
Looking forward to it.
So, help me understand political science. Like, what is political science?
It's a really great question. A couple of different ways of thinking about it. Political science as a science is as old as Aristotle. He wrote an essay in which he argued that political science was the master science. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand why leaders behave the way they do, why people who have power behave the way they do, what are their motivations. And that could be psychological motivations, it could also be their need to meet the needs of the citizens, there could be economic motivations, there could be a range of things. And so what it means for my students, or for me practically, is we kind of have to be craftsmen of all trades, in a sense, to understand all of the forces that go into policy making and political decision making. And then the science part of it is to try to develop a way of evaluating competing truths beyond just rhetoric or partisanship or ideology. How do I know if these two people are making a claim about what's good for economic growth that one's winning and one's losing?
Gotcha.
And that's the science part of it.
What got you interested in that? Was that your first love, or what?
No, it wasn't even my second, actually. I started out really wanting to do astrophysics, believe it or not. And there's a scientific method to the natural sciences, which I've always been enamored with, and I started out wanting to study cosmology and the motions of planets and travel and those kinds of things. And as I got older and moved into middle school and high school, discovered that I didn't like math nearly as much and wasn't really sure what the value of astrophysics was to me and to my life. So I ended up getting a degree in history because I wanted to understand how the world had become what it was. And eventually started to realize that history is great at explaining the past, but it doesn't really help me understand the future very much, because the tomorrow isn't yesterday. There are differences. And that brought me to political science, because at the end of the day, what we as political scientists have to do is we have to try and make predictions about the future based upon what we know of the past and how the world works and operates. And it's that predictive function of political science that really brought me into it whenever I was deciding what to do with my life when I was in my early 20s.
So in some ways you're interdisciplinary.
We have to be.
So you have to know enough about economics.
Right.
You have to know enough about sociology.
Correct.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. In the class, I just got through teaching a class. We were beginning the lesson on public policy. And on the first day, I have to explain to them classical economic theory, but I also have to talk about race relations, and we have to talk about the effect of Ukraine on gas prices and foreign policy. And then we had to get into a discussion about morality and the fact that human morality picks policy preferences, and so the relationship between abortion and economic growth in 50 minutes. And that's what every 50 minutes is like in a political science class.
So do they look like, those when you're in a car and the top's down and the hair's blown back, you get in there and you just blow their hair back, huh?
One of the things that we try to do as a discipline is we try to put our hardest classes right before lunch, because we recognize in Western political philosophy, for example, students are going to come out, if I've done my job well, they've talked about a whole bunch of stuff and they have very real and emotional opinions about these things. If I've done my job well, they've been challenged in some way about what they believe about the world. And I put that class before lunch so that way students can kind of walk out and take a breather and talk to their classmates about what's getting to them, or just be alone if they need to, because I wouldn't want to do that at 8 o'clock in the morning or at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah. When we're talking about the political science, and there seems to be a bit of quantitative, so you're always looking at the data coming out and what that might provide, but then there's got to be the qualitative.
Sure.
There's got to be, it sounds like there's some intersection there that you're always trying to find some sort of way to explain things, I guess.
Yeah, we talk about the difference between the is and the ought. The ought are the things that we believe to be true for philosophical reasons. How should the world be? And how the world should be is often a function of our personal preferences. They're a function of our religious beliefs, our moral behaviors, or the other way around. They're a function of the world that we live in, the times that we grow up in, and these are very qualitative things. Like, I can't test the existence of God. I can evaluate your belief in God, but I can't quantitatively determine what's moral or not necessarily. Those are ought questions. But we then can say, okay, based upon your beliefs and your behaviors, what are outcomes? And if you have a set of beliefs, which choices can you make that are more likely to get you the things that you want out of your life? And to do that, we have lots of data. In fact, some might argue that in the modern world of social media, we have too much data.
Sure. Because
we can monitor everyone's behavior. And if you have a big enough computer, you can almost not perfectly predict outcomes, but you have enough information you can manipulate outcomes on a large level, because we know what you want and we know how you're likely to act to get it.
And if you need to change the messaging a little bit to get what you want.
Yep. In fact, if we go back to the presidential elections of 2008 and 2012, in 2009, Barack Obama won the International Award for Marketing, because what his administration, what his campaign was doing, was they were sending out 15 different versions of an email and the differences would be who was the individual that signed it, or what was the size of the font, or which call was I making? Was it a rational call or an emotional call? And then they were getting feedback based upon response rates, and it's usually a question of who's going to give me money. Yeah. And as we determine who's most likely to give me money, they start to manipulate the author and the call so that in future iterations they know who to target it to.
Right.
And that's
Absolutely.
part of the reason why they were able to...
and that was what,
That's 2008 was the presidential election.
So 15 years ago-ish.
It was a big...
It was there. Yep. Imagine what it's like.
Yes.
They get really good at these things.
Yeah, it is significant. Now they don't even have to send you the initial email. All they have to do is look at your credit score and your social media behavior,
yep.
and they already know what to get you.
It's pretty amazing what they have access to.
Yeah.
So what's your special research or academic interest?
I started out mostly, I guess this is still true, interested in institutions. Institutions are the things that provide structure to our lives. They create the incentives for our behavior and for our choices. And the argument that I make as a discipline is that government works best not when it's telling you what to do, but whenever it's creating a world that you'll choose to do what it wants you to, right? What's in your own best interest, hopefully. But you're making the choices based upon the world that's been structured for you institutionally. And understanding how those institutions are designed or shaped is then really important. I started out looking at these mostly in Eastern Europe, believe it or not, because as I was coming out of high school and going into college, we had these really cool laboratories in the former Soviet Union where countries were making the transition from communism to democracy. And they were experimenting.
And now they're making it back.
And now they're going the other direction. Yeah.
That's another day.
We'll now they're going the other direction. But it gave us the chance to look at, as these countries were figuring it out, they were making changes in real time, changing their party system or their executive branch, rewriting their entire constitutions. We had about 15 or 20 of them that were doing this at once. And so I really got into the party systems of Eastern Europe.
That whole Eastern Bloc then, and that was what, the late 80s?
So the wall fell in 89, really. The Berlin Wall came down in 89. Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And that produced the 15 former Soviet states and another 10 or so European states that we could take a look at.
So you're I mean, you as you were saying, you were seeing this happening and were able to study that.
Yeah, it was in real time, which typically we have this objection, a moral objection to torturing people or to manipulating with people's lives too much. And so a lot of what political science needs to do, as opposed to maybe a psychology, is you don't run a lot of natural experiments, because if your natural experiment is what happens if I impose dictatorship on you, probably shouldn't impose dictatorship. So we have to wait until somebody else is doing it. And then we can see, well, what happens now? And so these periods of instability, they're kind of laboratories for people like me.
To be able to expand your thinking or look at it from the ways that you've already sorted.
Correct.
And how's it actually working out?
Correct.
But there's so many variables. I mean, goodness, it's hard to even comprehend. I mean, we can talk from a scientific standpoint, like an empirical standpoint, about confounding variables. But I mean, everything about a nation or any governing body. I mean, there's like a lot of things going on. It seems like
there's one variable that's really, really important that we have to deal with in the social sciences. People change their behavior when you watch them. Rocks don't change their behavior because they're being observed, and birds don't change their behavior so much because somebody's taking a photo of them. But if humans know they're being watched, they change their behavior precisely because they know they're being watched, which is problematic. But the number of variables is really only a problem if you want to know how every individual behaves. And when we're talking about politics, I don't need to know how every voter votes. I need to be able to make guesses about what moves mountains, what moves groups of people. What are the things most likely to change the opinions of most people.
And the people at the top of those mountains is who you focus on.
Those are the ones we care about, And so I don't need to know how all Republicans will vote. I just need to know how 80% of them, 70% of them will behave.
Right.
And if I can get that, we can start making some interesting predictions about outcomes.
The relationship between political science and politics, I mean, is that as straightforward as it seems, or is it a little...
It's a bit like, lots of different ways that you can explain it. It's a bit like we're the sportscasters. We don't play the game, but we watch the game and have the ability to comment on it.
So you're like the analyst. I did notice a little resemblance with Troy Aikman there.
Yeah, well.
With facial hair.
Yeah, it's the Oklahoma-Texas thing, come from the same genes. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but the same thing had happened that you would see in the sports world, right? Players become sportscasters, sportscasters become coaches, players become coaches, coaches become sportscasters. Every once in a while, you even have somebody like a Jay Novacek from the Cowboys who goes into the booth and comes back out again because they can. You see that with what we do, that people go into politics, and when they can't, then they go into the classroom. And when they can't, then they go onto the television screen. And when they can, maybe they jump back into politics again because administrations change.
Right.
And so that's one way of thinking about it, is that we're sort of observers of the world and trying to predict who's going to win the next game and lay odds on the outcome of it. It's just that rather than the game being, UK versus Auburn, the game is Republicans versus Democrats.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the what was it? The 2016 election must have been a real fun if you're all about the predictions and laying odds. But
Yeah.
so based on your expertise and being a political science, help me understand democracy. Like, what is democracy?
Oh, that's a great question. At its root,
I wanted to warm you up a little bit before I
appreciate
had
that.
you dig deep,
At its root, so you have democracy and you have republicanism, which are cousins. They're not the same thing, but they're really, 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 really close, much closer than our founders give it credit for it. At its root, democracy and republicanism both argue that we as citizens own the state. It belongs to us in the same way that we would own a corporation at its root. And because we're owners, we get to have a say in the management of the thing. How much say, that's where it gets complicated. How democratic you are is a function of how much say the citizens have. How the company is ran has something to do with it. But at its balance, it comes down to it's ours. It's not the kings, it's not the aristocracies, it's not the communist parties, it's ours. And we benefit from it, but we also have some responsibility for it, just like any owner of any business does.
So if what I hear you saying, and I want to make sure that the democracy, I mean, I guess when I think of democracy, I think of, the one person, one vote idea, right?
Sure.
And that is that, I mean, that's true to some degree, right?
Yeah,
but it's not entirely true because it seems like it's more complex than that.
I give my students this analogy. A lot of people want to argue that democracy is like a light switch, right? Lights on, lights off. But the truth is, these things called dimmer switches. And a room can be brighter or it can be darker. And democracy is best thought of as being something that operates on a dimmer switch. At its full brightness, democracy is one person, one vote, regardless of race or gender. Maybe even regardless of age. At its full brightness, it probably doesn't include questions about where you came from or where you live. In its full brightness, it might even be you're a taxpayer. And so even if you're not a citizen, because you're a taxpayer in the school district, we're going to give you a vote on the on the school board because you're paying the bills, therefore you get some representation. Most countries dim that down a bit. We dim it down a little bit more than some when you think about things like the Electoral College or our voting restrictions on registration. But it's part of this continuum as opposed to you have it or you don't. And that's really not true anywhere.
So to say that the United States of America is a democracy is accurate?
Sure. We are not the most democratic country in the world, but we are democratic than most countries, more democratic than most. Historically, we've usually been in the top 10%. We may not have ever been number one, but we might have been for a little bit in the late 1800s. But even then, I'm not sure that's true. But we've always been kind of on the cutting edge, at the progressive front of democratization.
So the cries of we're a democracy are accurate.
Sure.
Are they the most accurate description of the United States?
So the way that I would describe it is we are a democratic federal republic based upon jus suis and jus soli citizenship. Meaning that we're a democratic...
There's a lot to unpack there. I think every one of those words is going to have a lecture on its own.
Yeah,
so.
we're a democratic country in the sense that the people own the place. We're Republican. We hire representatives to work for us. We're federal. We have both states and the national government. And you become a citizen by being born here or being allowed here. Not all countries do both. Germany, you have to basically be born there. It's really hard to become a naturalized citizen. In the United States, we've been pretty liberal on both fronts, that being born to a citizen, simply born on our soil, or being allowed in by law through naturalization is okay, which is very democratic of us. It makes us more democratic in some places, that we have this broad definition of American.
All right. So when I think of democracy, I sort of think of things like liberty, freedom. Should those be associated? I mean, I associate them with it because I associate democracy with how I believe in things.
Yeah, you're turning that dimmer up really bright whenever you start using those kinds of terms.
Oh, I didn't mean to.
That's pretty bad. Because if you think about what does it mean for us to own it, well, it means we have equal ownership. And if we have equal shares, if every citizen has an equal share, every citizen has the same right to speak, every citizen has the same right to develop their own morality, every citizen has the same right to communicate via the press, every citizen has the same protections from the authorities through, be it searches and seizures and protections in a criminal court, right? Every owner should have the same right of ownership in a full democracy. And as you start to restrict those rights, either as a group, which is what we call civil liberties, or when you restrict them to certain groups, which is civil rights, then you kind of turn that dimmer down a little bit, and we become less democratic. And at some point, it gets so dim that old men like me can't see anymore. And then we would stop calling it democratic.
That's when I think you should use your ears more, but that seems to go with the side, doesn't it?
Yeah. It's not helping me much either.
So in what you're saying, what I'm hearing is that while democracy has a lot of opportunity, or I guess for any individual, democracy has a full potential. Mm-hmm. And that full potential has to do with being able to participate and as you say, ownership. Mm-hmm. But then in reality, based upon just the complexity of groups and grouping and just other things in history, that it's not that true for everybody. So everybody's at a different level of dimmer. Would that be inaccurate?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, at different points in our history, we've gotten brighter and darker. And that's, if there are 50 states in the United States, each of the 50 states are differently democratic. Some states are more democratic than others. There's different ways of thinking about being free, and some states care more about some parts of that freedom than others do. And because individuals take on responsibility differently at time or in different places, maintaining a company, owning a business requires some responsibility. And if citizens are less responsible, then you start to lose democracy, which some would argue is part of what's going on in our country right now.
That was, as you were speaking out, was sort of the question, is that responsibility that's involved with participating in democracy. That seems like a pretty big challenge, or are people just disgruntled and just don't want to participate? And your comment being that that's sort of what's happening now, is that people aren't taking that responsibility.
Compared to other countries, we've always had lower voter turnout rates. Some of that's been systemic rules that keep people from voting, and a lot of it's just been people don't think that it matters as much as it actually does, and so they don't participate. And part of that's personal, right? Like, it may in fact not make a difference to me who's in charge. If you don't own anything, it doesn't matter whether property is protected, right? If you never run your own business, it doesn't matter if business rights are protected. If you never do anything that challenges authority, it doesn't matter if privacy is protected. And if it doesn't matter, then I'm less likely to exercise my shares, which is true with most of us. Most of us have shares of stock in our retirement accounts, but we don't vote whenever we receive a letter from the company saying we can, because we recognize, look, my 5 shares are irrelevant compared to Elon Musk. And in the grand scheme of things, his decisions are more important than mine, and so I just kind of throw it in the trash.
Yeah, that sort of Pareto principle where, 20%, make all the money and make all the decisions, all that sort of thing. But there seems like there's something to be said about if groups could actually find common ground, the numbers, right? I mean, if every vote does count, but what I hear you saying too is that not everybody votes, so your vote doesn't count at all. And you know, but if people were to organize themselves and there are, we know there's special interest groups and things like that, but what's the typical voting turnout for a federal election?
In best case scenarios, if you exclude the last 2 elections, if we can get to 55 to 60% of the voting public on a presidential election, we've done well. We've had some that have gone below 50. The last couple of elections have been particularly spirited. And so we've actually gotten voter turnout rates into the mid to high 60s, which is, you know,
as compared to what's one from a state. You talked about other nations that have way better.
Yeah, mid to high 60s would be low for a European country. There are European countries that have voter turnouts consistently in the 70 to 80% range. For lots of different reasons. Some of it's actually mandated by law.
Which gets you up to 3/4, which is a super majority or something like that.
And you can be pretty sure in those situations when 70 or 80% of the people voted. But if you think about it, in the United States, if 60% of registered voters vote, but only about 2/3 of Americans are registered voters, then you have 60% of 66%. You have less than 1/3 of the American population is actually participating in an election. If a person then only wins with a bare 50% majority, which Trump won barely in the Electoral College vote, or Hillary Clinton barely in the popular vote. When you have a bare 50% majority, you're saying that 16% of the public approve of you, and for that reason, you're now in charge of everyone. And that's part of the reason why we say, well, maybe you don't turn our dimmer quite as bright as you do in other countries, where everybody's participating, where you have to have a coalition that's constructed that requires a near majority of the people to have the support behind the government before the government can take control. In the United States, if you can get to 20% of the people supporting you and voting, you can win.
So that's a quantitative issue. That's a numbers issue.
Right, that quantitative versus qualitative divide. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So, and I think you've hinted on the qualitative, like doesn't affect me, or maybe they can't get off work. I mean, that
sure
might even be somewhere in between there. But those countries that do a much better job, is there something in particular that they do, or is it just our apathy towards
voting
politics?
is a holiday in most countries in Europe. They would have you vote on Saturday rather than on a Tuesday. Right. I mean, the idea that we have to vote on a Tuesday in November as opposed to voting on a Saturday in June, when the weather's better, when the days are longer, when the days are getting brighter rather than shorter. In a lot of countries, they won't let public opinion polls be conducted in the 3 or 4 days before the election. So there's some uncertainty about whether or not my vote matters.
Right.
As opposed to, you referred to the 2016 election, Hillary Clinton probably would have won that, but so many Democrats were convinced that she was going to win that they decided, what's the point in me going to vote? Had they not known she had such a huge margin, they would have shown up and she would have been president, right? And so they do those kinds of things. Some countries, we require by law that if you're called to jury duty, you have to go. We require by law that if you're called to military service, you have to go. Other countries say if you're required by law, you have responsibility to vote, you have to show up and vote. And we don't do that.
Yeah, and I guess that's something y'all have, as political scientists, have thought about for a while. It seems logical that if you're, it's not really being forced to vote, but I guess maybe it is. I mean, you're forced to make a decision, but I guess I don't want to make a decision is also a decision. Yeah.
Or I don't care about a decision, or I choose not to participate out of protest is a decision. There are things that are more valuable to my time is a decision, which is why we don't typically have those in our country. We tend to view your right to vote as a right not to participate, although we still do require people to participate in the jury system.
So going back to the democracy question and then freedom.
Yeah.
So And just maybe help me understand a little bit, because I'm not a historian necessarily, and that's why I watch a lot of documentaries, so somebody else can, and then I'll have to rewatch them again when I forget. But the idea of freedom and democracy seem really connected for the United States, which goes back to what we were just saying. I have the freedom not to vote, right? But then we want to stand up and say, but I'm free to do whatever I want to.
Yeah, one of my favorite song lines in Western music is a line written by Chris Christopherson. It's an old Janis Joplin song. Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose, right? And that's really true, that we are at our most free when we don't feel like our actions are going to have serious consequences. If my decision to vote today means I get fired tomorrow, I'm not balancing legal restrictions, I'm balancing my economic restrictions, right? In some countries, they really, really worry about what we call the social democracy question. How free are you from want? Norman Rockwell had a very famous painting about the four freedoms, and one of them was freedom from want in the 1950s, that you don't have to worry about where your next meal is going to come from. You don't have to worry about will you have health care. You don't have to worry about is there going to be a job available for you. Because if you have to worry about those things, you're less free. Our country tends to be more concerned about, given the fact that there is the possibility to choose, do I have the maximum number of choices? I may not be able to make all those choices, but how many different religions are available to me, and how many different restaurants can I go to in Campbellsville on a Friday night, and how many different places can I move to if I decided I wanted to leave it all behind and I don't care whose feelings I hurt, where can I go? Where can I invest my money if I want to make as much money as I can? We're more concerned about those kinds of freedoms, the freedom to choose from available options, rather than making sure there are options available.
Why do you think that is? Is it because, I don't know.
Yeah, we're Lockean. So going back to that qualitative question, our political origins are in John Locke, and this idea that we are born endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. We have the unalienable right to life, we have the unalienable right to liberty, and the foundation of Lockean principles is that we have a right to property. And because we have that right to property, the protection of property and our ability to acquire property becomes fundamental to who we are. And it's why we care so much about gun rights in America, is because we are drawn to this idea of things like ownership. Other countries are more Rousseauian, and it's less about property being a thing that we should acquire and more about how property creates poverty, and property creates inequality, and inequality creates unfairness. And if we want to have a society based upon fairness, we have to have a society based upon equality, and that means we need to have a society where property matters less. And because we started our history down this Lockean route, and we've been following that Lockean route, Bernie Sanders aside, we are kind of drawn to that culture.
It's hard to draw back from either wanting more or keeping what you already have, even if what you already have is way more than you could even consume or that you can even use.
And in our origins, I mean, it's important to understand, again, Native Americans were there, but we didn't care. It's important to understand that we were born with this view that there's a nearly unlimited amount of property available. If I didn't have any property in Virginia, I would go to Kentucky. And if I ran out of property in Kentucky, I would move to Missouri and Kansas. And there's always property. We still have property unclaimed in the United States. And if property is readily available, the idea that property is inequality isn't going to stick with you. If I want more, I'll just go somewhere else and claim it for myself. In Europe, that wasn't true in the 1800s. Property had already all been claimed and had been claimed for hundreds of years. And so they're going to be more enamored by this idea that the inequality they see is a function of their history. And still today, we think we can create more wealth faster than we can divide it.
Yeah, and that's an interesting, because what I guess hear you saying is that it's almost in our societal DNA.
Sure.
That you're more valuable. You as a person are more valuable based on the property that you have, be it, you know, credits in the banking system, or you know, what your house and you know, all of that.
That's exactly how a Thomas Hobbes, or maybe even a John Locke, would have described it. That the value of a person is a function of their power, and wealth is power. Therefore, my wealth makes me more valuable.
I can dim it. I can turn it up brighter because I own a business and some land and it's got plenty of money in the bank.
Sure.
And all of the things that, and I don't have to worry about my next meal or my, you know, all the things you were talking about, the Norman Rockwell, freedom from.
And on some level, isn't that the goal of business ownership, right? You work really hard when you start a business so that you don't have to work as hard later on. You work really hard so that you can have, so that later on you can use. And you can use either for your children or to exert greater control over society or to provide yourself with greater luxury, right? This is fundamental to who we are as a risk-taking society, that hard work now gives me more power in the future for myself or for others, or over others. And we don't see a problem with that. And other countries that have a history with class-based society are a little bit less enamored because most people never get access to power.
Well, could we see that from a corporate standpoint, corporatism, if you will, that the power now seems to be, again, as you know, not a political science. A lot of the powers, and maybe it always has, but tends to be with corporations, and they got it full. They've got it cranked all the way up, you know, in terms of their how they affect democracy.
When you look at the periods of progressivism in American history, there is the progressive movement that was mostly in the Republican Party. Some Democrats were progressives, but the Teddy Roosevelt progressivism around the turn of the 20th century was caused in part because of the robber barons and these other things we learned in civics class, where you had monopolies and trusts that needed to be busted and newspapers that were being used to own and manipulate information. And then you see a progressive movement now, which is being caused by the same general sense, that corporations own everything and that information is being controlled. And it started in the left, but you also have people on the right who are talking about maybe Facebook has too much control over our media.
The censorship item.
In the same way that Teddy Roosevelt would have made that argument in 1900 or 1905.
Well, then that brings me to the question of freedom of speech. Help me understand freedom of speech.
So the Supreme Court has this great way of explaining it, I think. The Supreme Court argues that the first line of self-defense in a democracy is your ability to stand up and defend yourself. And in a democracy where we're fighting about political ideas, the principle, the core value of self-defense is the ability to stand up and say, I disagree, or I agree, because that's the self-representation. I can't fight for my own views if I can't articulate my own views. I can't really even have those views if I can't argue and debate those views and test them against others in the marketplace of ideas. And so that's what freedom of speech is about for most liberals or libertarians. It's about self-representation and self-defense in a political economy. That
you have the right to say whatever you want to.
Yeah.
Even if you're not in the majority.
Especially. It's not freedom of speech if everyone agrees with me. It's just simply saying what everybody else says.
If you believe it, then it's fine.
Yeah. And that's one of the tensions in democracy that we see, is that democracy requires the protection of minority rights. Because I don't need laws protecting the majority from the majority. I don't need a constitution that says that the majority always wins and therefore the majority is protected from themselves. Right. The purpose of a constitution is ultimately to make sure that the minority is protected and that unpopular views can be spoken and that unpopular religions can be worshipped. Otherwise, you're moving away from equality.
So in a democracy, even if the majority has spoken, let's say, and a law's been made, Is there still room to disagree? Is there still room for freedom of speech?
Yeah, and the real question becomes levels of acceptable speech, and how much speech or how we practice that speech, or the unintended consequences of that practice, as opposed to the content of the speech. What you have to say, you should be allowed to say. Is it so an open debate, which I think is relevant to both Black Lives Matters recently in 2020, and also to the debate contemporaneously about COVID. Is it okay for somebody to block an interstate and prevent the flow of traffic in and out of an urban area so they can get their point across? Right? It's okay if you're Black Lives Matters, you should have the right to express your opinion. If you are anti-vax, you should have a right to express your opinion. Does that right to express your opinion include shutting down the economy of a city, causing greater inflation and potentially starving out the public?
Whether
right?
it's vehicles or just the mass of people.
Right. The principle's the same. And so when arguing about or debating about the freedom of speech, we have to figure out at what point do I draw that line where inconvenience becomes...
Well, it's one thing to say something, it's another to act,
Sure.
I guess that's where it becomes freedom of speech, freedom of actions, I guess...
The courts call that symbolic speech. So the things that I might wear on my shirt, or the flags that I have outside of my house, or the bumper stickers that are on my car, these are symbolic actions. Whether I have a flag or I burn a flag, according to the court, is a symbolic action. My choice of vocabulary is a symbolic action. And the courts have said that those are protected speech. And then if I get together and I do it with other people, freedom of assembly, we kind of move into a different one of our freedoms. But the same thing, same truths apply. Yeah, freedom of association as an action, which is not in the Constitution, but we've kind of invented using the 10th Amendment.
Are there any, like freedom of speech? I mean, I've talked to several people and I hear inciting to violence being one, and then hate speech.
That one's more complicated, but yeah.
And I know that you're from the standpoint that you're probably looking at it from a legal point of view, which I sort of am too.
Yeah.
Are there limitations to freedom of speech?
So the general rules that we have, you're not allowed to misrepresent the truth in the battle for the truth. I teach to my students that the purpose of freedom is the fulfillment of purpose. And if my purpose is to seek truth, and I'm lying, I'm violating the purpose, therefore I've lost the right to freedom.
So it goes back to the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law.
Sure, the spirit of the law is what the letter rests upon. What John Locke, again, our OG in political philosophy, John Locke argued that there can be no law that violates natural law. Natural law is the law of truth. So any rule that protects your ability to lie violates the fundamental law, natural law. And he would say that that's not permissible. And typically the courts have taken that position, that if you use speech to lie, that you violated the right to speech. If you've used speech to cause harm, if you've used speech to take rights away from others, then you're violating the purpose of freedom, and therefore you don't have freedom.
Then we get, truth, right? And I think that our discussions about, the scientific principles and things are... that's one thing, because we're talking about facts coming from, some scientific empirical method, right? But then, truth gets a little bit fuzzy, because one person's perspective is their truth. And so, when you're talking just now about that as long as you are representing the truth, then it's okay. It's when you begin to misrepresent the freedom of speech. And so what happens in,
So I'm gonna jump to a different freedom, so I can invoke a different philosopher.
Sure.
I'm gonna jump to freedom of religion, to explore this idea of truth. There's a philosopher, he's a French philosopher, unfortunately, his name is Durkheim. And one of the things that Durkheim pointed out is that it's not religion unless people agree with you. It's just something that you've made up. Right? That religion requires a sense of shared value. It requires a sense of shared practice. And there's an American philosopher of religion who added to this. He said that at the end of the day, if the only person who worships what you worship, you're really just worshiping yourself. You've created yourself as God or yourself as truth. So to answer your question, if you're the only one who believes a truth, you're just simply believing in yourself. And why the Constitution gives you the right to be yourself, it doesn't give you the right to impose yourself on others. Right? Okay. Because, so it is accurate to say that we might have a shared sense of right and wrong, but if we take that shared sense of right and wrong and we go one step further and say, by imposition of will, we're denying you your truth, we're denying you your freedom, then I've now violated the principle of our greater truth, equality, because I've taken yours away without good reason. If I have good reason, then there are lots of examples of us saying you want to do something and we have a really good reason to stop you. You want to use crystal meth, but we have a really good reason to stop you.
Right.
So we're going to make that illegal. We have a really good reason. We can do that. Power of government to protect itself, the power of government to protect society from bad behavior is pretty absolute, even according to Locke and Hobbes, or Rousseau or Durkheim.
So, that getting back to the truth thing, because I think that's a really I'll say sticky sort of subject, because and if the premise of that is that you essentially, just because you think it doesn't make it true is number one, but if others also think it, then okay, that's okay.
We've turned the volume, we turned the dimmer up a little bit.
Because you have a grouping now. It's not just one individual, and then if it's not a factual thing, like let's say a quantitative way to say yes or no, is or isn't, and even there we know there's shades of gray, so to speak. Then how do you, that aspect of truth? I mean, that's a pretty, when you have a group that says this is true, and you have another group saying this is true, but and maybe even both sides can make a quantitative case for it, then it becomes qualitative case.
Without intending to, you have brought us back to your very first question, why am I a political scientist? Because whenever I would study philosophy or religion, or whenever I would study history, there's something that's missing that is present in the scientific method, whether we apply it qualitatively or quantitatively. This idea of verification, or this idea of replication. I tell students that I think one of the biggest problems that we have is we're not trained in probability well enough as a society. We tend to look at things as absolutes rather than probabilistic. Right. And as a political scientist, one of the things that we try to do is how do I evaluate competing claims of truth based upon the probability that one's right or one's wrong, or based upon the most likely outcomes of their behavior. And even if I can't necessarily compare two truths against one another, what I can do is I can say, well, you have a truth which leads to a set of actions. Do your set of actions logically come back to your truth, or do they create a world that contradicts yourself, the hypocrisy of truth, the hypocrisy of knowledge? And if your beliefs are inherently contradictory, then they can't be true, because you destroy yourself.
If you say one thing and do the other, then there's a lack of real truth there, is what I hear you saying.
It's not even if you say something and do the other, although that might be the case. That happens an awful lot. There's a general principle, again, the purpose of freedom is the fulfillment of one's purpose. A democratic government can tolerate any idea except the destruction of democracy, because a democratic government can't tolerate the killing of oneself. We have laws against suicide, and even people who try to commit suicide will probably tell you that there's this moment. The ones who survive an attempted suicide will tell you there's this moment where they realize this might not have been the right call, right? Because the fight to live, to maintain. And so if you have a set of beliefs that suggest a set of actions, and the result of those actions is the death of belief, well, the actions may extend from the belief. The problem is the belief is corrupted. And part of what we have to do...
A logical fallacy.
A logical fallacy, yeah, exactly. And so part of what we have to do is evaluate those claims qualitatively or quantitatively to look for the internal consistency of an argument in addition to how well it competes with other arguments for real-world outcomes. Does that make sense?
A lot of it did.
Okay.
I'll have to have you back on, and we'll cover.
Yeah,
I might have to look up some of those philosophers and see what they have.
There's a pretty complicated argument there. I apologize.
No. That's why I love the number one that you can put it in layman's terms, because that's what I am, and the insight, right? And so we. The freedom thing and the freedom of speech and all the other freedoms that you've mentioned. And so as a political science, I'm going to say you're the closest thing to a doctor, like a medical doctor, not a philosophizing doctor like a lot of folks we know, but someone who can take the temperature and look at the symptoms and say, how are we doing as a democracy? Are we we need to call in the specialist?
I would argue that in the United States, it's really, we can almost put a point in it, 1954. It might have been a little bit earlier, but there was actually a conference in 1954. It's been the obsession of American political science to think about democracy. In fact, I would think that's probably all we really do in American political science, is we're trying to understand democracy, good, bad, indifferent, how we make it better, how we make it worse, how we've gone too far. It's really our obsession, is to take the temperature of democracy. And then, people, like they do with most philosophers, they might choose to ignore us. But every once in a while...
Or not understand you.
Which is why, coming back to the second question you asked me, one of the reasons why the collapse of communism was so intriguing was because there were the efforts on the parts of these countries to say, we have this history of constitutional engineering, and we have these people who've studied voting rights and voting law and constitutional design, and these people have made arguments about what works and what doesn't. How much do we want to incorporate these into our designs? And the ones that were more successful have tended to be more stable and more democratic, and the ones that were less successful have become Belarus.
Would Russia be one of the successful democracies?
No.
What is it then?
No.
I mean, they have some of the they have a president and an election and things like that.
Sure.
There's some similarities that.
Yeah, democracy started in Russia. They tried. They may not have tried very, very hard, but in 1994, 1995, 1996, there was real hope that Russia was moving down towards a democratic path. But Russia has extremely high levels of inequality. And while the political engineers were playing around with the Constitution, they didn't do as good of a job at trying to make sure that the wealth of the country was being redistributed. And I'm not talking about like perfect equality like, communism, but just the idea that all of the oil wealth shouldn't be in the hands of 12 people.
Would they, not to interrupt, but would they consider themselves a democracy?
Well, they probably would.
Like if you were talking to, would they say, oh yeah, we're a democracy just like the United States?
I would think they would definitely be able to claim they're a republic just like the United States.
Okay.
In the sense that there's to the degree that the state is owned by the Russian people, I would say they're probably a republic. I would say that Iran is a republic. The Islamic State of Iran
that's in their name anyway.
It's owned by the people. However, in Russia, the people's ability to vote and to have effective control and to participate freely has all been, at this point, extremely curtailed. I mean, we have, as we speak, the war that is happening in Ukraine, where protesters were showing up on the streets in Moscow and immediately being whisked away. Compared to in our democracy, when we invaded Iran or Iraq, we had to build fences around the Capitol building, or we had to build fences around the White House because of the protesters. And we didn't move them. We just built a fence there to make sure that the White House was protected. But there were protesters throughout the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. complaining about those wars, right? And so for those reasons,
it sounds like there's a lot more uncertainty with the democracy because you're dealing with the large.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
in totalitarian regimes, dictatorial leaders, they don't like uncertainty very much. Whereas democracy, almost as a matter of faith, we have to accept the fact that the only thing certain about the future is that people I don't like will eventually be in charge. I just don't know when. Yeah. And I'm okay with that because I know that eventually I'll get my shot too. Yeah. And that's true with capitalism as well. We don't really know how this investment's going to turn out, but we can do the best we can, and the world might be a better place.
Well, capitalism's another. That's a whole nother.
Yeah, that's a different topic.
We'll have to definitely get you back for a couple of other things. One last question: how do you think artificial intelligence has and is and will affect politics, political science?
This is a great question. And
we only have a minute left, so I'm kidding.
So two broad answers. We were discussing the elections in 2008, 2009, and the ability of those campaigns to adapt as a way of maximizing vote share or maximizing. Artificial intelligence potentially gives political campaigns to do that not only in real time but in pre-time, effectively creating a situation where societies are being overly manipulated. But the other thing that artificial intelligence can do is if I can program an AI system to fully understand the behaviors of individual citizens, it can almost create a government on autopilot that will make the decisions that the people would have made anyway if we had elections. And then I don't need as many of them. And I could maybe get more.
There's probably a few people that would actually not mind that.
Yeah, because let's face facts. I mean, elections require a lot out of me because I've got to learn about a whole bunch of candidates, including city council. And so there's some hope and fear about AI, just like with any other new technology.
And the aspects of it that you're talking about are sort of the one of the big fears in those watching the industry is that loss of both cognitive ability and control, you know, over. So the idea that, well, it's just easier if somebody does it for me, tell me what's best for me.
Sure.
And so you don't even have to put forth the effort, which builds the trust in that and that even more. It's almost like this self-realizing cycle where, okay, well, I don't really want to put the effort in.
Yeah.
That responsibility of the civilian, if you will, or citizens.
Is hard. Yeah.
And so you let it make a decision for you, and then maybe even convinces you that was a good decision.
Yeah.
You know, and so okay, well, that worked out for me. I'll, you know, and the more that you do that, the more control you give over to it, the less autonomy you have in your own life by choice.
One great way of thinking about it is which is the more free animal, the wolf or the domesticated Cocker Spaniel? I mean, they're from the same species, essentially. You can even interbreed wolves with some domesticated dogs. But the act of domestication has done something to the domestic dog. It makes it easier for us to live with. It makes them more useful to us. Right. But the wolf, that's the hardier animal. And one of the things that, we can go on this for hours, one of the things that technology might do in general, but what AI specifically does, is it domesticates us in ways that aren't necessarily any better for us than it would be for a wolf to be put into a cage.
All right. How pervasive it is, how we don't even know all the things that, and technology in general, but artificial intelligence, it would be tough to have someone point out where AI has touched their lives, and also the difference between what they've seen as AI, like a super intelligent, and which is mostly sort of a dystopian, you know, future-based, you know, AI comes over and destroys humanity, takes over the world, right? I mean, that's, oh no, that's, I mean, there's not, versus I guess, a more subtle AI that is slowly taken over to give us more we're more dependent, more reliant upon it to do certain things.
Yeah, we live in a world where most of us have become comfortable with, we turn on our television and Netflix says you can watch anything you want in the world. Here are 5 things that we think you'll like. Yeah. You turn on YouTube, you can watch anything you want in the world. Here are 5 things we think you like. And I've learned what you like based upon your previous behaviors.
That's right.
And the result is that I only pick the things that you think that I like, which means that now the things that I see are being narrowed by my own self-interest. But the problem is, and this is the wolf turning into a Cocker Spaniel, my preferences when I was 18 suddenly define who I am when I'm 50.
Yeah.
Because my original choices have a path dependency, a linearity to them. Yeah. The AI that I programmed when I had programmed when I was 12 influences what I do when I'm 42.
Absolutely.
And so when we talk about animals, one of the ways that we've described it is that the act of domestication is the act of keeping a dog juvenile. That the domestication means you never really grow up. You always remain childlike. And there's a lot of that in political philosophy as well, that what it's really about, it's about keeping you in a childlike state because the child has no moral superiority over the parent. Rather, the parent has some moral obligation to protect and take care of the child.
They haven't done the hard work of that maturing process,
right.
that hero's journey sort of thing. Yeah.
The development of self-reliance and self-respect, right. Trust, knowing that I can overcome a threat because I've done it before, so I don't need somebody else to make those choices for me. Yeah.
And the living with choices. You know, the good and the bad, and moving on.
So on some level, what AI almost becomes in the political realm is it becomes the Netflix for social systems. I'm only given access as an adult to the political choices I would have made as a child.
Which may not be a terrible thing if it's making choices that are based on the common, maybe as an altruistic sort of philosophy that with all this data, we're going to do the best thing for the most people in the best way, sort of thing.
And if you think that the best example, the best face that humanity can provide is the middle school cafeteria, then you're right. And so I would suggest that
I don't know what your middle school cafeteria was like, but
that's the point, right?
Yeah.
Like the ways that we get together when we're kind of forced into social interaction, but where the rules are taken off, and that's what cafeterias are like in middle school. You follow these rules all the time in the classroom, but we're going to put you into a cafeteria. We're going to give you the food that you need to keep you alive. We're going to give you the space that you want. You're going to have human interaction. What happens next?
Don't throw the food, but everything else is.
What happens next?
Well, sometimes food gets thrown.
And the fear of AI is that essentially society turns into middle school cafeterias.
Yeah. Well, and the other fear is that it's going to be too big to unplug.
Sure.
So be careful what we, the heroes we make, the parents we make for our middle school lunch.
Now that we're all effectively cyborgs,
right?
Because of our cell phone.
Absolutely.
How do we go back to being human rather than being cyborgs? Yeah. And today, I would say that most of us, and certainly almost all of my students, are effectively cyborgs at this point.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for coming and sharing your experience and wealth of knowledge with us. And hopefully we'll have you back on.
Thank you. This has been fun.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us with this episode of Help Me Understand with Thomas Jeffrey and my guest, Dr. Shawn Williams. Have a great day. That was lame. I got to work on that.
That's what editing is all about.